I have today with me the author of FVM.
While the team was working on the app and building some of the app, I was looking for something to build with Go.
What was some of the challenges that you had when you've been building this CLI with Dart? Why did you even move to Dart? What was the motivation behind it?
I think I enjoy Dart a lot. I know that programming preferences are tough. Dart became a lot better because we start building other tools.
What is a version management in general? How does it work? How you manage and create a CLI for that?
The first version of VM was probably the most stable version because we were the only ones using it. So it worked 100% of the time for our use case.
It is a great project, of course. It's a big project, of course, but it's not as scary. That's the whole purpose of this session. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Flutter Original. I bet when you're working with Flutter, at any point or some point, you are facing of testing your application with different SDK version of Flutter. And then there's always a tool for that, right? And one of the best one, or the only one maybe right now in the community, is FVM, or Simple Flutter Version Management. I have today with me the author of FVM, Leo. So hello, Leo, how is it going?
It's going great. Thank you so much for the invite. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. I think, Leo, before we move on to FVM, and even, before this session, we decided to go to the engineering part of the FVM and figure out how it actually works. But then before doing that, Leo, so probably introduce yourself and tell what you do. And for those who don't know you, it's going to be a good starting point.
Absolutely. I'm Leo Farias. I am a Flutter GD. I'm also a CEO and co-founder of Concepta, which is a software development consultancy located in Florida, in Orlando. We are around 45 people and we do a lot of enterprise software. And I spend a lot of my time focusing on open source, doing R&D, trying new things, and especially using Flutter and Dart.
Leo, I know you for many years, but when was the first time you tried or you started working with Flutter?
So I think maybe it was before version 1.0. I think I end up 2018 or beginning of 2019. I don't know exactly when it happened. So we are testing our hybrid solution for a startup I had co-founded, and we wanted to do obviously iOS, Android, and we validated Flutter. And at the time, they still did not have support for platform views. So we didn't even have a web view. It was a video platform, so we barely had a video player. And that's when we started exploring. But I remember that even then, even though like Flutter was not fully baked, the first time we built a UI, we kind of focused on iOS, and then we got the crappiest. That's the story that I tell. That's when I fell in love with Flutter. Is we got the crappiest, smallest screen Android device, and we ran, and it looked amazing. And we had like a slider with parallax, with zoom, and it just looked amazing. I had never seen that before, right? And I worked with a lot of a hybrid platform. So that was when it piqued my interest. Okay, there's something interesting happening behind the scenes, the way these issues are being tackled in order to achieve that. So that's where I became very interested in the technology overall.
Interesting. So many of us have the similar kind of situation where something like, ticked and said, there's a difference between this one and the other ones, that we tried. But absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
No, absolutely. Especially as you go through, and no technology is perfect. And obviously Flutter is not perfect, but even at the time, it was clear there was a different approach on addressing some of these issues long-term, which we start seeing a lot of the results now more than ever.
Exactly. So as far as I know, Leo, you've been very active in the community, and you also have done different open source projects. And the most well-known one is the FVM, the Simple Flutter Version Management. How did you end up creating this package or tool? And tell us the story behind it somehow.
Yeah, so doing that, I mentioned that we work on a video app at the time, and we validated Flutter, and we chose to go with Flutter, even though there was some risk involved. And because we're still in the middle of things that we needed were in the master channel. So for example, things like the video player, right? We had almost like weekly, to pull weekly things from that came with the video player plugin. They were in the master channel at the time, or dev channel, beta channel. So in the beginning, especially because it was before version 1.0, there was a lot of moving parts. And while we were building at the time, I was CTO at the company, and we also were exploring Golang. And while the team was working on the app and building some of the app, I was looking for something to build with Go at the time to put it and put into action. And that's when we start discussing about a lot of this problem that we had, where we had to switch the channel. And every time we had to switch the channel because it was happening multiple times, you had to re-download it, rebuild it, and things like that. And it was just like very slow of a process. And that is exactly when like, okay, but this doesn't make sense because if you work with all the hybrid platforms, you can just download whatever version you need. So I started exploring. I saw that there wasn't a really solution for that. So the first version of FVM, which was used internally, was actually written using Go. And of course, it has been already a couple of years since I've already migrated to Dart, or a few years. But it was probably like the first version of FVM was probably the most stable version because we were the only ones using it. So it worked 100% of the time for our use case. But yeah, that was initially what we had to address. It was just very tough to test and even like test regressions. And yeah, it was just a tool for us to resolve that problem.
That's interesting. You said that you started with Go. I mean, I was following FVM for a long time. And then you moved to Dart. So this wasn't part of my question, but then it came up right now that how was the experience here? Like, first of all, why did you even move to Dart? Like, what was wrong with Go? Or probably nothing wrong, but what was the motivation behind?
Well, I guess a couple of things. So I don't know exactly the repository, but someone had actually forked the Go prod repository, and I don't think they maintain anymore, but they actually updated for some time the initial FVM. But if not, I can go to the history there. So the initial version of FVM was very basic. I mean, it was like a nicer bash script, right? So pretty much what it was doing, it was just like almost moving folders around, right? So it was moving repositories around. So like it's download, it moves, and then, kind of links and does the sim link and stuff like that. So it was very basic. But when people started using it and started having like people not only open issues, like, okay, this needs to be a little bit more of a robust to many dev environments, then it was an easy decision to go to Dart because not only it kind of gives you a lot more visibility on a lot of the tools and the Flutter tools, which are all written in Dart. So it becomes much easier to reference and use it. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel because a lot of the packages also that are used within Flutter tools, they're open source, they're available, so you can get to use them. So it seemed like it was a natural progression to go into Dart and be able to take advantage of that. And I think Dart became a lot better because we start building other tools. So for example, another tool that we had, it was another CLI for white labeling apps. So it was like building the process. So it was good to have like our tools in Dart since the team was able to maintain things like that. And also the community were able to adopt and contribute to and so on. So it made a lot of sense to go to Dart. But in the beginning, FVM was a much, I won't say simple because FVM is still like on a high level simple, but it was more like happy path FVM, right? Yeah. It didn't try to be a lot of defense to all the things that could be happening in your environment.
Okay, nice. So I think let's maybe do some pair programming here and also go walk through us. You need to walk through us the code base. I have a couple of questions over there, and I think people are going to be interested to hear from you where you are the author. But before we go to the source code and talking about like how actually is version management works, maybe you should in maybe quickly 1-2 minutes just give us an overview of how people can use FVM, just how they can install. Is it installed via like pub, or do you have like brew, or do you have like some script? Like how can they install? And also maybe a few basic commands just to give some context, like what this package does or these tools is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just going to go here to the FVM website real quick. So as far as installation goes, let me zoom in. So there's a few ways to install. Obviously, FVM is a pub package, so you can install using pub, right? So you can do Dart pub global activate FVM. Now, normally if you're using FVM to manage your global version, I always suggest to install the actually executable. And with this, for example, Mac, Windows, and Linux, there's a few different ways. On Mac, you have the install, and on Linux also. You can install, you have an install script, and also you can install through brew. And the good thing about this is because FVM becomes this standalone environment, right? So now it's not dependent on which Dart version and Flutter version is installed in your machine. And as you can imagine, if you have a package that depends on, let's say, the Flutter and Dart SDK, but it self-manages the Flutter and Dart SDK, you can get into a little challenges. So that's one thing. If you're doing a lot of advanced things, I suggest people to always install standalone. And on Windows, you have Chocolatey, and of course, the executables are all on the repository. So a few different ways you can install it.
Okay. So once we install them, we have FVM as a command line. We're like, right?
Correct.
So initially, when I install this this package or these tools, will it immediately actually change my path for, let's say I have already a Flutter and Dart installed. Will it change it immediately, or I need to actually run some command to change that path?
So let me go back here to the code. So one thing is that you can continue to have your main path version for Flutter. And to be honest, that's what I do myself. So I always have Flutter stable installed on my path. And I use that VM pretty much to run versions on a per project basis. And the reason I do that is because, of course, working with FVM, I always have access to the standard Flutter installation if I need to test something out, right?
Oh, I see.
So FVM, you can already start using FVM on a per project basis without any problem. And I can go through some commands here because one thing that FVM allows you to do, the main focus is, obviously to use on a per project basis, and you can actually pin that version. So now like, okay, the last version that I ran was, 3.17 or whatever it is. So I can go ahead and use this version, and doesn't matter if I'm collaborating with other developers or if I open this project 6 months later, I always have access to the same version, and the tools are always gonna work the same, right? I don't have to worry about migrations. FVM also offers global command, and in this case, when I do FVM global, what it does is actually, so if I go to FVM list, okay, one thing that you'll see, you're going to see the size of the directory that is there, the cached versions, and you're going to see the versions that I have installed there in the release dates, right? So it just helps kind of get situated. The version and also the Dart version that is there. In this case that I have a stable version, it says, okay, you have installed 3.19.5, but there's actually a new version out.
I see.
Right?
So for those that they're not, this is actually a good command that you brought it up. So for those that are not really familiar with version management, so the way that you are now handling the versions is actually you download the SDKs, put it under a specific folder, which in this case is FVM versions, and then you switch different versions based on that, SDKs that you downloaded, right? Okay, that's good start for the engineering part. So we're going to get to the code afterwards. Move on.
Yeah. So I can always use on a per project basis using the FVM use, but one thing I can do is, in this case, if I use VM global, what it does is it tells me that I can actually use VM to manage the machine level, right? The path version, right?
Yeah.
And once I run the command, it says, okay, if you want to use it, you can use it, but you got to change the path to this default file, default bin folder. And once you do that, it means I can do VM global, and it switches the path version, right? Through symlinking. So I can do that. But a lot of the popular use case also of VM is to just use on a per project basis.
So your recommendation is just to keep FVM for projects, not the global one.
It's tough to make developer recommendations. There's so many.
Well, I mean, as an
many specifics. That's what I normally do because I like having access to a stable version on the global path. Now, there are cases that people need it, and there's cases that I switch because on FVM I can do. If I use the one command that is somewhat like advanced, but you can use it, is I can do spawn, and if I do FVM spawn, I can actually run a command on that version. So I don't need this version globally, right? So I can do FVM spawn stable version. So I'm running the command on that version. So by doing the spawn command, I don't need it to have it globally installed. I can just spawn any version and run the command against it if I need it, right? So this becomes very useful if I'm not in a particular project, right? Or if I want to run a quick command on a specific project.
I mean, maybe this could be a use case, like even if you are in a project and you want to run your test, let's say for both two versions or a couple of versions, you actually can have this in your CDCI, right? So, or not CDCI, sorry, or even CDCI. Yeah, you can have that, right? You can just say, okay, that's interesting.
And that's one thing that that's on the roadmap because we had a use case. So for example, one of the packages I'm working on, Mix, there's a minimum version, and you'll be surprised, even though you have the constraints for package creators, people don't test against the minimum constraints. So there's an easy way to kind of test it on the minimum constraints and also have that when you have other contributors doing it. Because, so for example, Flutter sometimes can automatically rename values or apply linting based on a new version, even though your package should still support an older version, right? So that's one of the things that we try to do is reference that particular version, especially for package authors is very useful.
Interesting. So I guess, again, lots of people right now watching, and then they can go through the commands, and they may even have worked with FVM before. I don't want us to go through the commands and talk about them. So this is something that you already documented. I personally am very interested of looking at the source code of FVM, like how you manage things related to FVM and the code, the CLI, and everything like that. I think it's going to be interesting to learn from this package that you created. Maybe we should move to the source code. So first thing first, I think people can clone this repository under Leo's profile. I will actually have some subtitle right now, and then this is the link. You will see the link in the below. You can clone this. Once you clone it, then we get to this repository. So Leo, tell us, like, I now clone this repository. First thing you need to tell me is an overall engineering or architecture part of this tool. So how do you manage things, how things work, like overally, without really going through the code, just to understand, if I want to understand like a package management or version management, what should I know? Like these things that you are organizing related to that.
Okay. So when it comes to VM, I'll break it down into a couple very specific things that it does, and I can touch on the directory level. So the first thing a VM does is install the version and make sure it is installed properly, right? So it's installing and caching the version and managing that version, right? Meaning if there's an upgrade, if I want to install another version and so on, right? Kind of like managing the status, if it's good, if something changed on it and so on. Another thing that it does is to make sure that is compatibility. So it's resolving the dependencies, which is something new on VM 3.0, is to make sure that that version is compatible with your project, okay? And the third thing that it does is making references on the project to that version, right? So it creates the necessary references in the project so it can run that version. It manages things like ignore, sim linking, settings files, and so on. So it supports the IDE, so it becomes seamless integration. So those are the three pillars, if you will, of pretty much what it's being done. Do you want me to go over the directory structure a little bit, like on a high level?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay, so as soon as you go in, and there's no perfect way to organize it, so it's open source, so people want to critique it's been there for a while. But one way to think, so first step here, you have the commands, right? So here are essentially the commands. So if I want FVM Flutter, you can go here and this is the command. FVM Global, this is the command, right? FVM Install, this is the command. So first step is like there's a file for each command. So normally when people, especially if they want to contribute, if you go ahead and do like, oh, FVM Install doesn't work, and you want to, let me take a look to see what could be happening. It's going to commands and going to install, right? So as soon as you go to install, here you're going to start seeing like flags, the settings, and it's very, one thing I like about it because I think CLI are great beginner projects for people to contribute and people to see because there's not a lot of external dependencies, right? You run a command, executes, and it like dies off. The life cycle is very simple, but this pretty much allows you to kind of go through it in each particular command. So that's the first thing. So you can think of commands similar to like on controllers on the API on the server side, right? So essentially like that's the API that you're going into. Models are self-explanatory. These are just, let's say data transfer objects, models of different things that are there. And then we have services, okay? And these services are services, but they try to separate functionality into specific things that needs to handle, right? Obviously, I have a base service because some services they need logging and so on, but then I have a service that runs the cache, right? So it manages the cache. I have a service that runs the configuration. There's a service to run the Flutter service, right? That kind of picks which commands to execute. There's a project service. So everything that is project specific that I need is also separated in a service, right? A global version. So services are just grouping of functionality for specific use cases to go through. So, from logging and so on. So if I go to the cache service here, one thing that you can see is I have things like verify that is executable, verify that versions match, right? So you can see a lot of these like helper things like getting the version that is cached, right? I want a cached version from a Flutter version that is there. I want a list of the cached versions, right? So you can see here, it's just like a lot of utilities that I need from a caching perspective, right? I want to get just a directory. I want to verify a cache. So this allows me to just like group all the functionalities into one. So that's the main purpose of services.
Interesting. So these are the three major, let's say, part of this CLI right now. So you also have, I see you have workflow and also utils, but those are also kind of self-explanatory. You may explain them, and I have one question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
So let's say now, so as you said, this is a good project to learn from. I want to go ahead and create a similar CLI project. So first thing first, do you use any kind of package for the to handle these command line, arguments and stuff like that, or have you built everything from scratch yourself?
So I made adjustments and so on, but a lot of for IBM 3.0, the logging and some of the update things, of course, they have all the customization because the way it's deployed, right? You deploy executables and so on, but it's fairly standard. If you use something like a very good CLI, it has a lot of the different pieces there. There's some changes and adjustments that I have to do, but I feel like it's a solid place to start. And the main thing is like logging and when showing errors and knowing when to show errors. That's the most challenging piece for FVM because there's too many environment variables there, right? So that's the first piece. One thing that the very good CLI does not have, which I suggest, is the context piece. So the context piece of FVM, essentially it becomes like a dependency injection using a package called scoped. And let me know if it's getting too much into the weeds, but just the main purpose of this is to allow to change the scope and easily get different versions of the services and have the services be able to use different things. So the context is, for me, a huge differentiator that helps the maintainability of VM, because whenever people wants to do anything at a settings or make a change that affects everywhere, they don't have to go through the code and every single piece. Normally is like on the creation of the context or making something available within the context, and you can handle it. So having the dependency injection is very helpful also for testing, right? Because I can test the services in different ways, but I can also run the context. For example, when I run tests, I create multiple FVM directories, so they have to run into separate contexts so they don't conflict with each other, right? So there's a lot of benefits of separating the application into these almost like separate environments, right?
Okay. So another question I have, let's say I'm now cloning this. I understood like the folder structure right now, and I want to start contributing or adding or deleting or doing something. Let's say a command. I want to add a new command, FVM whatever. So that's a command that I'm just going to add. So how should I start doing that right now? Where is the entry point? Which file is the first file I need to look into to understand better this CLI?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll mention also like later to just touch on workflows. If you don't mind just like touching real quick, because workflows, so you have services and you have the commands. So it's the API and the low level. Workflows are, as a developer, I name things, as you can see, like very workflow, right? FVM is Flutter version management, right? But these are a specific sequence of services that needs to be called in many different commands.
Oh, I see.
Right? So I need to ensure cache flow. I need to resolve dependencies. So I just kind of grouped all these workflows because the install, the use, the global, sometimes they all have to run these workflows even though they're separate commands. So we can think of workflows as separating this sequence of commands in one place that I can better have a handle on it. So if you want to contribute, let's say if you want to add a new command, right? One of the ways I always suggest people to go, at least that's when I go into a command. So I have something like install command, right? So if I go here to the install command, I say, okay, this is great, but where is it being called? So one thing that I always do is to look for the references. So the first thing I do, I tell people is like, okay, I want to do something like the install command, but I want to run like the install command, but I want it to do something else. So I can go here, right click, and sorry if it's a little bit small because the resolution, but it's right click, find all references. And you can see here that one of the places that's being added is on the runner Dart file, right? So now on the runner file, and you can see here is the root. You can see that this is the command runner, and you can see that all the commands are being added there. So if you want to add a new command, I suggest people to always get a command that is very simple. It doesn't do much, or it could be even the install. But you can go through it. I'll go back here to the definition, and you can just copy this into a new file, right? Rename install to something else, set up any of the flags, and then bring it into the runner, and then you have a command.
Okay, so to let's think about it. So we're going to create a command line. So the first thing we need is just the runner that is piling up all the commands, and then there's associated arguments, let's say, or flags to that command, right?
Yes.
So for this purpose only, are you using any package? I think you're using args package, right?
Yeah, args is the main package that is being used here.
Okay.
So args command runner, CLI completion. I'm using the Mason logger for my logging package.
Okay, that sounds good. So if you want to start like building a CLI, these are the basic that you need. So now we're gonna go through this purpose. So I'm just gonna create that's another question for you. So how does FVM becomes like as the main runner? Like how do you define that? Like if you want to change it tomorrow to something else, how do you do that? Like how do you change FVM to something else?
Okay, so as far as from an executable perspective, normally when you configure pub, they tell you to also configure like a pub cache file in your path.
Yes.
And the reason this pub cache file is configured in your path is because when you use something like Dart let me see here. So I'm actually have FVM installed through brew. So I'll go ahead and uninstall and I'll go ahead and install the package. So, okay, so now FVM is not found. So one of the things, let's say if I want to run this version that is on my machine, what I do is Dart, let me go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. So Dart pub global activate source path. Okay, so this is pretty much the command, and I'll leave it here. So this command pretty much says, okay, I want to have this version of FVM installed globally. So I want my path. So the equivalent of saying Dart pub global activate FVM, but instead of doing it from pub, is doing it locally from here. The way Dart is, if I go to bin, the binaries, you can hear that I have a main Dart. So essentially when I run the FVM there, what it's doing is running this command here. And I'll show real quick on PubSpec. So on PubSpec, you can see here, hey, what are the executables? The executable is FVM and it points to main.
Yeah.
So that pretty much what is letting you know that that's the command in the file that it should execute. And from main, it executes the runner. You can see here that the first thing it does, it creates the context based on the arguments on the scope, right? So that's why it kind of creates the separate environment. And then it executes the runner with the arguments there.
Exactly. Okay. So this is then the entry point of running the commands in this file. Then everything starts from here. Then it goes to FVM command runner where you add more commands.
Yes.
Okay, that's fantastic. So it's okay. I think it was pretty clear for everyone, even if they have not done any CLI before. So we now know where to start, where to look for, and then we start going through deeper, like go to the commands. Maybe one step further. Let's go to the command, and then we use a couple of packages such as args and args CLI command or runner to make sure that the commands are running. So maybe just one more thing is if I want to now go ahead and just add one more argument, how do you define that? So there was some syntax. Just maybe show that quickly so people can see that where to start with.
Yeah.
And also, go ahead.
No, so here, this is the args package. So pretty much there's a few different things. If I go add, so you can see here that add flag, add option, add multi-option. And this is all the arguments that I can add. And I can say if they have the default, if they're negatable, if they have like a short version. Some have like an abbreviation, right? Like setup. So I can go ahead and use it this way. Do you want me to do it real quick?
No, I think this is pretty clear. But I have one more interesting question for you because you have done quite a lot with CLI and Dart for CLI. So what was some of the challenges that you had when you've been building this CLI with Dart?
So I think I enjoy Dart a lot. I know that programming preferences are tough. Of course, there's some things that I would like, things like data classes, obviously, and like unions. I don't know if that's something you should not say, but I feel like from an API, I see arguments why people don't want unions. But when you're actually exposing an API, I feel like unions allows you to have a lot cleaner, better API for other people to use. But it makes sense. This creates some challenges also, right? But I think for me, the toughest thing about Darts, which is solved by, I feel like it still needs hand-holding from me, for VM, is the fact that the CLI has dependencies on the Darts version that is installed. And that sometimes is difficult for people to grasp, right? So when you install a package globally, depending of the version that you actually installing that version with, it impacts the constraints of the installation of that version. And the reason this becomes challenging is because if FVM goes without an update for the next year and a half, whatever it is the next version of Darts, it can actually stop working unless you have the executable, right? If you have the standalone, it's fine. And that's one thing that sometimes like things are working great, and then there's like a new version, and sometimes it's a regression master, and then it creates like this compatibility issue that is there. So I think that is a challenge. I think FVM aggravates the problem because it's managing the version. So people are actually, I have people that actually run version 1.22 or something of Flutter,
Wow.
which, so I say like, okay, install the executable because, it becomes tough to be compatible, right? And the tough thing about also FVM is because I want to use the latest and greatest of Darts, but I don't, because if I just use the latest and greatest of Darts, it means that people can only install globally with the latest version of Darts, unless they install, again, the standalone, right? And this is challenging. Some people are like, okay, why don't you just upgrade? Like, I can't upgrade, right? Because if I upgrade it, it's that many people so the constraints needs to be very large. So I think that is the toughest challenge. And because when you get these errors, the errors are very generic, right? Okay, incompatible version found global of some package, but it's not clear what's supposed to happen, how you should do it to avoid. And sometimes people don't even know what they're doing differently, right? Because the Dart version updated or something changed. So I think from a CLI perspective, that piece is tough because it's almost like all the global packages, they are snapshotted to one version of Darts, right? So that can cause issues. And that's why the executable helps a lot from that perspective.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. So for the last part of this, before we actually finish this coding stuff, I would like you to show us the install command. And I have one question over there for you. So because the install command, I think, is the one that you download the SDKs, you store in somewhere, and then this is gonna be interesting to just quickly walk us through how you download, how you manage. Sometimes people see these progress bar. How do you manage that in CLI? Like, how do you show that and stuff like that? Or even sometimes you're proxying some logs from another command under your command that is run and through your command to show in the command line. I think this is something that is happening also somewhere in the install.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and just destroy my cache real quick. So, and you can see here that I'm actually running it locally now. That's why I had to build the package executable, because I just ran locally there. So I'll go ahead. All right. So if I go to FVM list, I have no SDKs installed. So the first thing I'm going to do is the first time I run FVM install, and I'll do stable. Sorry, the cache was already installed. Let me just 1 second. Let me actually clean up the whole.
Yeah, no worries. We can cut this section. Don't worry.
Yeah, cache directly. Okay, I'll go ahead and do it again. All right, so FVM list, no SDK is installed. So I'll go ahead and do FVM install stable. So the first thing that it's doing is, and that's something that is FVM 3.0 does, it has to clone the repository from Flutter. So, and that's one good point to mention, is that everything that FVM does is just cloning through Git. So people are like, oh, there's something happening with FVM. Like, okay, did you try to do it with Git? And like 98% of the time, the same issue happens. Because all FVM does is clones using Git. And this mirror is going to clone the repository. And instead of having to go the GitHub repository every time it wants to clone, is going to get it from the local cache now. So you can see here that it took, it was fairly fast, but 1.9 seconds. So if I go FVM install beta now, you can see the version installed and didn't create, so it's much faster, right? So the version is already installed there. 1.9 seconds is just the final cloning. So you can see here that like it was much faster than creating the mirror and everything. So that is one of the things that FVM does, is kind of keeping track of this mirror and keeping it up to date, or referencing the mirror and updating from that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so that part of CLI that you showed, this progress bar, this is actually done in FVM CLI, right?
This like create mirror in the progress bar, yes, that's all within FVM.
It would be nice you show us one part of the code that is actually responsible for this part, this UI and this command, and just walk us through that. It's a lot of information here. It was a couple of just lines, but I guess there's a lot of code behind it.
Yes. Let me select it. If you want to edit this and make me look really good, install command, because I want to see, because it's separate utility here. Ensure cache workflow. So you can see this is pretty much getting the repository that is there, kind of keeps the local mirror up to date, right? So it checks that is a Git repository, and then it does like syncing the local mirror, right? And if it doesn't have the local mirror to kind of keep it up to date, what it does is creates it. Right. So essentially, I have this helper function, which you're going to go into, but pretty much as a clone with a progress. And once I go here, I'm starting a process, right? So you can see as an equivalent of me just doing git and passing on the arguments, but I'm listening for the output. And what I do is the output goes in and I update as the progress, right? So I go here, every time there's like a no line printed out, you can go ahead here and check the progress, and that's pretty much what it's doing here to create the percentage. So yeah, those are the type of things that like a lot of parsing, a lot of separate things happening here, but this is what is being done. And one of the tough things, because you want to provide like a great developer experience, but because this output is dependent on other tools, sometimes these other tools can have versions that can break. So that's one of the things that, you want to show people a great experience, but it becomes difficult to be consistent with it, right? So that's one of the things that the progress does. For example, like if there's a parsing error, it just says, hey, oops, just continue. Like we got a parsing error, but still look for the error code, right? If there's no error code, just assume things are worked out fine. Because sometimes there's regressions on other packages or the version that people install it, the output is a little bit different, right? But this has been working fairly consistently.
Interesting. So this is a lot of information. I think this was interesting. This is probably the first time we're going through the FVM source code in this channel, at least, and a lot of information here and a lot of things that you mentioned, and it's interesting to learn as well as take a look at see how you are doing that. So interestingly enough, until now, I thought you are actually downloading the SDK version from somewhere that SDK is residing. But now I see that you're not doing that. Actually, you are cloning the repository of Flutter, which is interesting. How do you manage the version in this case then?
So there's a couple files. So the first time, let me know if it gets into too much detail here, but I installed the version. If I go to VM list, you can see here that I have the stable version installed, in beta installed, but actually it's installed there and I have the reference, but I actually don't know which Flutter version is actually there. And the reason I don't know is because I've cloned the repository, but I haven't really, when you first run Flutter, it downloads a lot of dependencies, runtime, Dart, and so on. And that's where it comes through, right? So if I go to VM spawn stable version, you're going to see that it's going to do the downloading of VM. And this is actually what is going to download the Dart SDK and it's going to do everything that is needed there. So it creates references. The SDK creates references. So VM doesn't create anything within, but I use those references to know what is happening, right? That's one thing that, so if I go here to a VM list, you can see here that now I know, right? Because I know for sure that this is the Flutter version, this is the Dart version that is there. And one thing that VM3 does, if you run that version and it says, okay, this version is supposed to be 3.19.5, but actually changed to 3.19.6 because it wasn't a stable channel, it was a version. It says, hey, this version, it's wrong. It's probably being upgraded. So it actually allows you to say, okay, what do you want to do? Do you want to move this to 3.9.16 so you have to re-download it again? Are you okay with that? Because it can just move it. So it kind of lets you know that like, hey, the version might have changed because maybe you run an upgrade behind the scenes, and actually gives you the choice of caching it separately and now referencing it correctly. So that's one of the things about VM is about the developer experience, right? Kind of managing when you install it, checking the constraints, saying, hey, do you want to install this version here? Because it's saying that this version of the Dart SDK that you're installing is not compatible with this project. Do you want to go on? So that I think is 80% of what VM does is this hand holding, if you will. It's kind of trying to be defensive about what could go wrong, right?
Interesting. Leo, if I want to now install Flutter stable version 3.0.0, just because there was some bug, something. So yeah, you use the release command.
Yeah, so if you go to VM releases and its command, you can see all the versions they are available. And you see that beginning Flutter, I used to do the little V in front of it, but you can kind of go back and see all the versions on the stable channel. And you can see all the other channels also, but by default it's stable. And you can install any version and it tells you like, okay, it actually tells you which version you have installed also. So that's a nice thing that it does.
But what if I want to now install version 3.19.0, not the latest, but this one?
Yeah, so you can just do a VM install in the version. And one thing that is interesting also is that VM actually allows you to install commit. So if you have a commit hash on the Flutter repository, you can actually do a VM install.
Okay, that's actually very useful.
Install. Yeah, which is good if you want to test like a regression, see if something fixed an issue. It's very helpful from that perspective. perspective. So I'll go ahead and do a VM spawn. And one thing is that when I'm using the use command, if you don't mind, I'll just show you like a basic workflow of the use command, because the use command kind of handles a lot of this, but I'll just go ahead and do the VM list real quick. Yeah, so it wasn't finished. Let me show okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm running the version locally on my machine, so I shouldn't have stopped. But one thing that the VM, it's the happy path, if you will, is I have a VM use stable, for example, and is running version that is there. And what it's going to do is going to resolve the dependencies of the package. And the reason this is taking a little bit longer is just because I just ran locally. But one thing that you can see here is as soon as I do this, VM creates this file that links the version there. And if I go here, it automatically handles the git ignore, right? But it's actually hidden on VS Code, but there's actually a symlink version that is here. So if I go view on Finder real quick, yeah, so you can see here that like that's a symlink to the version, right? So it's not actually adding the version, it's actually linking the version on the cache. I see, here, right? You can see all the versions of VM are there. So it's doing a symlink for that. And another thing that it does, so for example, if I go to Flutter version, you can see that I have a stable. One thing that it does also, if I go to VM use 3.19.0, let me see if the version is there already.
So this is only happening on this project, right? It is not
happening on this project. Yeah, correct. So this is happening only on this project. So, and this is a great use case here, because what VM is doing is say, hey, you wanna link this version of VM, but actually it tries to resolve the packages, say, hey, this version is not going to resolve your packages. And then it gives you the option to like, do you want to go forward? And this is one of the great things about VM, because it's being defensive about, hey, it says it mentions the constraints should match, but cannot resolve, right? So maybe the constraints are wrong. So you can you can choose to move forward or not. I'll go ahead and move forward because I live dangerously. And one thing you can do is that once I move forward, you can see on the right side that now I have these warning things here. And the reason why is because VM changed the path of Flutter. So now VS Code is telling you, hey, the terminal changed, right? Yeah. So if I go here and I open up again the terminal, you can see that the version will be linked. Sorry, just because I have the version locally here, will probably.
That was correct version 3.19.0.
Oh yeah, it was. Sorry.
Yeah, that was a correct version.
Yeah. So Flutter version. Oh yeah, it is. I saw like stable. That's why. Sorry about that. Yeah. So version 19. So you can see that is the correct version now. So one thing that VM had to do it before is you had to do like VM Flutter to proxy the command. In VS Code, you don't have to do that anymore. You can just change it and use Flutter. And actually, when you're using something like this, VM is not doing anything else anymore. Right? Okay. It's like it's configuring VS Code and it's just handling by itself. So if I go stable again, you're going to see the same thing is going to happen. And it changed here again, the warning that is happening. And I'll open again.
But only works in VS Code, right? Only works with VS Code.
Yeah, this particular in VS Code, because it kind of tells you the terminal and you have more control. Android Studio is different from like a workspace perspective.
Okay, well, cool. So then I can have multiple versions right now, even here. And technically, I mean, last question, and then we go to the last words of this session. Because there is a chance that I want to have multiple versions. Right now, we have 3 versions, let's say, and all of them at the same time for project. So especially when we run a test, we just want to run a test in all of these versions. Do you do that with FVM spawn that you showed, or do you manage it differently? Like you list them here under FVM RC, or how do you manage that? How do you do that?
Yeah, so one thing FVM allows you to do, it has this flavors. So one thing I can do is VM, when I install a version, I can do the version and actually give a flavor to it, right? Flavor is the equivalent of environments in Flutter, right? So if I go VM use stable flavor production, you can see here now that I'm saying like, okay, production, you can use stable or whatever it is. But if I want to use develop and I want to use 3, right? So you can see here that I link those versions. So what I suggest is like, if you have like a minimal or whatever versions you have, you can have those versions there and you can run the command. You can do VM use production and it'll ping the production version out. So you don't have to remember the version itself. You can just say, I just want to run production. But one thing, you can run the commands the same thing, like, so you can use production execute, but I suggest to now run them in parallel because they have to still resolve the packages, right? So depending, and that's one that's kind of talking about the little bit the challenge of the Dart SDK is because depending on which version I install of the Dart SDK, the packages that are going to be resolved to are different. They're still going to be within the constraints if I can, but it might be different, right? So that's one of the ways that I suggest is you can do the VM spawn command on the CI when you want to do that.
Okay, makes sense. Good. lots of good commands. I mean, people can go through the documentation, take a look at the, details of these commands. But I guess we got a good impression of what is a version management in general. How does it work? How you manage and create a CLI for that, how it works. And we know now this is actually a fully written in Dart project. So you already walk us through the folders and the high level architecture. People now know. Hopefully this helps for people to send you some PRs and, contribute to the project. I mean, great work, Leo. Amazing. This is great. So do you have anything that you want to show or you want to tell us as a last words of these sessions?
No, well, thanks for having me on. I think it's great to engage the community. One thing that I think of FVM as a way, if you haven't contributed to open source, I always try to be, when people want to contribute for the first time, kind of letting them know which steps to go, or, hey, I want to do this command. I'm thinking about doing this, and saying like, oh, did you think about doing this? Do a PR and I'll review it. So try to kind of onboard it as much as I can. So I do think CLIs are an easier project to do that. But if you want to contribute, if you want to solve bugs, there's like issues. One thing that I guess there's a good suggestion. There's some of the projects, I have a lot of open source projects, but you can kind of go through it. And I try to label good first issue, because sometimes like there's not priority, but sometimes there's like an issue that doesn't touch a lot of different things and it's like lower risk. So I try to put like lower good first issue, so that might be like a good item to tackle if you want to get involved.
Yes, well, that is great. So I'm now also showing the good issue, the good first issue. So like people have some idea about that. This is great, Leo. Thank you very much. One thing I really liked about this session is we went through the package or the repository or the source code itself. And a lot of time I've heard from developers that they feel like when you've done FVM, it is a great project, of course. It's a big project, of course, but it's not as scary. That's the whole purpose of this session, so that now they've seen how you organize. There's a lot of files, of course. There are a lot of logics there, but it wasn't there in the beginning. Of course, you slowly added them, right? Mm-hmm. And now we know like where to start. Now we can dig into and learn more. So I know like many developers have these questions like, how can they make these UIs in CLI? Like, how do you make this progress bar with green color? But this is actually right now written in Dart. We all have done Dart and we can just go through the source code, right? You also have shown us already. So go through it and learn from it, and also contribute to the project. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, one thing I suggest that like what I like about some of these open source projects and other people can find it interesting is that once you start having a lot of these services, it's almost like you become this like internal API that is not documented. So sometimes when you have a feature, and this happened a few times, people are like, I would love this to happen also, this workflow to happen also, to resolve when this happens. Once you go through it, like you have all the API that is already there. Sometimes it can be like as simple as calling it, or just like calling them, because everything kind of like the lower level, it's already there. It almost becomes like composing the APIs in the sequence that you want, or something you want to do and handle it, right? So it becomes much easier to address any problems or be able to extend the project.
Exactly. Well said. Thank you very much, Leo. I think you're not going to be last time on this show. You need to promise to come back to talk about other projects that you have. But meanwhile, I really appreciate taking your time and coming to this show and show us FVM. And that was very fun. I really liked it and learned quite a lot. See you soon. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.